Everyone wants today's guest on their side. Feminists claim her as one of their own, conservatives admire her, romantics adore her. Jane Austen wrote her 200 years ago, and she still has a lot to say. Elizabeth Bennet, the most beloved heroine in English literature. Witty, principled, impossible to intimidate, and, spoiler, still very much in love with a man. Welcome to Coffee with Giants of Fiction.
I see you have done your reading. Or at least the last chapter.
Guilty. Though I'd argue the last chapter is the most revealing one. But let's go back to the beginning. Because your story opens with one of the most famous lines ever written. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. Is Miss Austen mocking the idea or endorsing it?
She is doing what any good writer does, holding a mirror so close that her subjects cannot decide whether to laugh or be offended. The line mocks the obsession, yes, but it does not pretend the obsession does not exist. Women in my world had very few roads. Marriage was not vanity, it was survival.
And in our world, women have every road. Careers, financial independence, legal equality. And yet, the conversation about what women want, what they need, what makes them happy, is somehow more confused than ever. Why do you think that is?
Because somewhere along the way, the people fighting for women's freedom decided that freedom meant becoming more like men. And that is not freedom. That is just a different kind of corset.
That is going to upset some people.
Good. Upset people tend to think harder.
Explain what you mean, though, because that's a serious charge against a movement that claims to have achieved real things. Voting rights, property rights, don't these matter?
Of course they matter. But there is a difference between saying a woman deserves the same rights as a man, which is simply justice, and saying a woman ought to want the same things as a man. That is not justice. That is erasure dressed as progress. And I would push back on something else. This notion that women fighting for their dignity is a modern invention. I come from a Christian tradition, and the church, for all its imperfections, never taught that women were worthless. Quite the opposite. Women were the ones who brought life into existence. That is not a small thing. That is the thing. And in many ways, precisely because women were considered more precious, they were protected. Given preference. A gentleman gives his seat. A gentleman opens the door. A ship sinks and the women board the lifeboats first. Was that oppression? Or was that a civilization that understood something about value?
But women couldn't own property. Couldn't vote.
It was not perfect. Lord knows I felt the injustice of it. I watched Longbourn, my family's home, destined to pass to Mr. Collins simply because I was not born male. That was wrong. I will not defend it. But you do know correct a leak in the roof by burning the whole house down, Joshua. The movement saw real injustice, and then overcorrected so dramatically that it ended up telling women that everything they had ever valued about being a woman was a symptom of oppression.
Give me an example of the overcorrection.
Gladly. The movement fought for women to be taken seriously, and somewhere along the way it decided the path to being taken seriously was to emulate men. Which might have been forgivable if they had chosen to emulate the best in men. Instead, and I say this with great sadness, a considerable number chose to emulate the worst. The promiscuity dressed as freedom, the emotional detachment dressed as strength, the aggression dressed as ambition, and then looked around, baffled, at why they were unhappy.
That's a sharp charge.
It is an honest one. And it grieves me, because what women were being asked to abandon was not weakness. It was their greatest strength. A woman's sensitivity is not a liability. It is how she reads a room, raises a child, holds a marriage together through seasons that would break a lesser foundation. Her empathy is not softness, It is a form of intelligence that most men spend their entire lives trying to learn and never quite manage. Her capacity to nurture, to see what is needed before it is asked for, that is not servitude. That is a kind of genius. These are not traits to be ashamed of. They are traits civilization is built on. Quietly, without monuments, without anyone noticing until they are gone.
But women make mistakes too. They misread people. They can be wrong.
Oh, I am well aware. I was utterly convinced that Mr. Wickham was charming, honourable, and wronged. I was wrong on all 3 counts. And I was equally convinced that Mr. Darcy was arrogant, cold, and beneath my consideration. Also wrong. Spectacularly so.
So the woman, famous for her judgment,
Was humbled by her own prejudice. Yes. And I am glad of it. But here is what troubles me deeply about the movement today. It has decided that a woman cannot be questioned. That to criticise a woman's choices, her reasoning, her conclusions, is an act of oppression in itself. That she must be defended simply by virtue of being a woman. And that is not respect. That is condescension wearing a political ribbon. If I cannot be wrong, I cannot grow. If no one may challenge me, I am not free. I am simply protected from reality. And reality, I have found, has a way of arriving regardless of whether you have prepared an ideological shield against it. Mr. Wickham was still a scoundrel whether I wished to hear it or not.
You're saying the movement infantilises the very women it claims to protect.
I'm saying that a woman who cannot be criticised is not being treated as an equal. She is being treated as fragile. And the great irony is that the movement that began by insisting women were not fragile has ended up building the most elaborate system of protections against any uncomfortable truth. That is not strength. That is a very modern kind of weakness.
Okay, but you, specifically you, pushed back against every convention of your time. You refused Collins. You refused to perform for Lady Catherine. Doesn't that make you exactly the kind of woman modern feminism celebrates?
It makes me a woman who refused to be diminished. That is different from refusing to be a woman. I refused Mr. Collins because he was pompous and dull and would have made me miserable. Not because I had philosophical objections to marriage. I wanted a partnership. I wanted to be known, challenged, respected. I simply refused to settle for less.
And Darcy gave you that.
Eventually, after considerable personal growth on both our parts. He was insufferable at first, if we are being honest.
He called you tolerable, not handsome enough to tempt him.
And I have dined on that story for 200 years. It is the gift that keeps giving.
But here's what I want to push on. You just described wanting to be protected, wanting a partnership, wanting a man who is your equal or stronger. And modern culture tells women that needing a man is a weakness, that self-sufficiency is the goal. What do you say to that?
I say it is the loneliest philosophy I have ever heard. Needing someone is not weakness. It is the most human thing there is. The question is never whether you need. The question is whether you have the discernment to choose well. I did not need any man. I needed that man. There is a considerable difference.
Last question. If a young woman today came to you, confused about what she should want, what she should be, what would you tell her?
I would tell her to be ruthlessly honest with herself. Not with the world will manage. With herself. About what she actually wants. Not what she has been told to want, not what is fashionable to want. What she, in the quiet of an honest moment, actually wants. And then have the courage to want it without apology. And I would tell her this. Your sensitivity is not a flaw to be corrected. Your empathy is not a weakness to be overcome. Your desire to love and be loved is not a failure of ambition. These are not the chains. These are the gifts. The enemy was never the desire. The enemy was always the pretending.
Elizabeth Bennet, everyone!
One more thing,
Of course.
Mr. Darcy. If by any chance he is watching, he is still the most aggravating man I have ever met. And I would marry him again tomorrow.
Elizabeth Bennet. Sharp enough to cut you and warm enough that you'd thank her for it. See you tomorrow.